Tomorrow, June 6th, 80th anniversary of D-Day, the Allied landings at Normandy in 1944 to begin the liberation of France and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. And our resident historian Felix Bonnell is here to remind us how Seattle and the West Coast got the news. It was on the radio, wasn't it, Felix?
Oh, yeah, and it began on June 5th, thanks to the time zone differences here and the technology that we had back then. Now, that music we heard at the top, that's from Bob Hope's Pepsodent show, which they were playing over on KOMO on the night of June 6th. We'll hear more about that in a moment. But this story is a bit of a greatest hits for me. We did a version of this for the 75th anniversary 5 years ago, right before I went over to France to be there in person for that anniversary, which was a trip of a lifetime. You know, interviewing D-Day veterans on Pegasus Bridge and at the American Cemetery, walking on Utah Beach and standing on a cliff and seeing that huge formation of C-47s flying off. That was just, I'll never forget that trip. It was amazing. Now, D-Day, June 6, 1944, landing on the northern coast of France, tens of thousands of troops, tens of thousands of pieces of equipment, easily the greatest military operation in the history of mankind. 80th anniversary this year, and they are marking the occasion in France, and there are fewer and fewer veterans left. Something like 100,000 of the total 16 million Americans who served in World War II remain. If you were 18 in 1945, you'd be 97 now. So it's a numbers game. There'll be plenty of coverage about the military operation by pretty much every news outlet tonight and tomorrow. I like to pause every D-Day anniversary and recall the role that radio played on D-Day. I love radio, in case anyone hasn't noticed. June 5th, 1944 was a Monday. The big war news that evening was that the Allies had liberated Rome, and FDR had been live on the radio giving an address about that. But then things quieted down and regular programming resumed. Here's what was playing on KIRO radio. Nobody called it KIRO yet. This is sometime after 9:30 p.m. on June 5th, 1944.
And now CBS presents the music of Lenny Kahn and his orchestra from the Hollywood Palladium on Sunset Boulevard in the heart of the nation's film capital.
You know, kind of a sleepy night on a Monday in June. You know, people knew the invasion was coming at some point, right?
Yeah.
So the first word that D-Day might be underway came at 9:48 Pacific time. That's almost 1 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast. Earliest bulletin was based on reports being picked up on German shortwave radio. American announcers cautioned listeners that news was unofficial, but there was so much anticipation for D-Day, the radio networks began operating as if it was the real deal. They stayed on the air into the wee hours with live network coverage, which was pretty much unprecedented at that point. Radio hadn't done that kind of wall-to-wall stuff yet. Now, the cool thing about the timing of this first unofficial word, just before 10 p.m. Pacific time, was that it was early enough to still catch most West Coast people awake and late enough to be missed by most people east of the Rockies. You know, one really bizarre factoid which gets lost in all this, I'll hold up this chart so the listeners can see it. See on the camera there? Mm-hmm. We had more radios more radio penetration, ownership of radio in the West Coast than anywhere else in the country. A full 95% of every home had at least one radio. In the Deep South, for instance, only 60% of homes had at least one radio. In the Northeast, 92%. So even the most popular part of the country, it was only 92%. Here in the West Coast, we loved our radio. So the timing and everything worked out that when the official announcement came at 12:32 p.m. on Pacific time on the morning of June 6th, it was a big deal here. And this staticky bulletin from London was heard by KIRO listeners 80 years ago tomorrow.
Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
I love that guy's voice. That's Colonel R. Ernest Dupuy, one of those $1-a-year men, kind of an advertising guy who was speaking live from Europe, volunteering in the war effort. I like to think of that 18 seconds of radio as the Gettysburg Address and Paul Revere's Ride all rolled into one staticky package. So from that point on, CBS and NBC were wall-to-wall for hours, though CBS did switch back to its regular soap operas during the day and got a lot of heat for it later. They do bulletins in between. Now, NBC and our pals over at KOMO stayed with the news all day. So the networks all cooperated to prepare for D-Day coverage so they could share information. A lot of times you heard the same thing both on NBC and CBS at the same time. Now, running things in London for the pool reports was the Northwest's very own Ed Murrow. Here's a report from Ed for CBS early in the afternoon on D-Day.
We have interrupted this program to bring you another special invasion broadcast. We take you to London for the report of Edward R. Murrow. Go ahead, London.
Here is a summary of the latest news available at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. There is no cause for pessimism. The beach opposition was less than had been expected. Our convoys did not come under serious attack. The minesweeping was good. It was a low-tide landing, and the minesweepers did the most difficult job ever done by the little ship. They established the clear water, and they led the big ships in.
Yeah, and there wasn't much detail in terms of the loss of life or casualties at that point. And to be clear, there were no live eyewitness reports of D-Day, but there were a few reporters along for the ride with portable recording gear, big and clunky stuff, where recordings were hustled back to London and played on the air. It was pretty amazing. A lot of people regard this as radio's sort of greatest, 24 or 48 hours. Now, on D-Day around 7 p.m., FDR came back on the radio with his characteristic long pauses between sentences.
My fellow Americans, last night, when I spoke with you about the fall of Rome, I knew at that moment that troops of the United States and our allies were crossing the Channel in another and greater operation. It has come to pass with success thus far. And so, in this poignant hour, I ask you to join with me in prayer.
Can't remember the last time I heard a commander-in-chief leading the country in prayer live on the radio. Now, this West Coast D-Day radio phenomenon has been studied a little bit by scholars, but I love that in this little clip from Bob Hope's Pepsodent show on the evening of June 6th, this is carried by NBC on KOMO again, he pretty much sums up the entire West Coast perspective about radio and staying up all night as he actually lived it at home with Dolores at the Hope family compound in Toluca Lake.
What's happened during these last few hours, not one of us will ever forget. How could you forget? You sat up all night by the radio and heard the bulletins, the flashes, the voices coming across from England, the commentators, the pilots returning from their greatest of all missions, newsboys yelling in the street, and it seemed that one world was ending and a new world beginning. The sun came up and you sat there looking at that huge black headline, that one great black word with the exclamation point, invasion.
In the radio landscape I grew up with in the 70s, it pretty much hadn't changed. If something happened and you wanted to know what it wasn't going to be on TV. Yeah. The newspaper wasn't going to be right in time. You turned on the radio, and if it was close to the top of the hour, you might get the news report, or you were reassured the world hadn't actually ended. If their voice was coming from New York, oh, good, we haven't hit it's not the end of the world yet. CBS is still available on KIRO. So.
That's right. And we're still here.
Yeah, exactly.
Felix Benell.
You sound tired, Dave.
Can you lead us in prayer, Dave?
We've been
oh, my gosh.
broadcasting ever since.
In our righteous might. I like how FDR right. gives a good...
Yeah, I remember my job used to be to actually sign off the radio station at night.
Oh, a daytimer.
Back at sunset, for that matter.
Yeah.
Back when things actually stopped
awesome.
for a while.